Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are in the world right now. Welcome to the start of a new series of lectures that we have here in the Menahem Merhavy Heritage Center, and the Zoom series that we've been doing now for several weeks. I believe in this meeting are a number of people who have attended previous lectures that we've done, including some that I've been involved in and have given, and also our series on the Prime Ministers. And we are now starting a new series on the contemporary Middle East that I've told you that I've been advertising and been sending information about to many of you. And I think we also have some new people on the meeting as well, so that's great to see. Before I start, I want to just say that those of you that have been here before may note a difference in the background. You're normally used to seeing me sitting in the Begin Center with a Begin Heritage Center screen in the background. I don't have that because I'm currently at home. The circumstances of coronavirus have hit my family somewhat, and we're in quarantine at the moment. Fortunately, no one in my family actually has corona, but my daughter is in quarantine because of a child in her class. So I am currently not allowed out of the house for a few days. So I'm doing this from my home. It's fortunate that technology allows us to do that. Okay, to the lecture. We are starting this, as I said, this 4-part series on the contemporary Middle East. We're starting with a look at Islam, which I'm sure you will agree and understand is really at the heart of so much of what goes on today in the Middle East and historically. And we're fortunate to have with us, talking about it and really guiding us through the Middle East for the duration of this series, Dr. Menahem Merhavy. I'll just read a little about him and then pass you over to him. Menahem Merhavy earned his PhD from Tel Aviv University. Formerly, he was a researcher at the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations at Hebrew University and a Fulbright postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas in Austin. He's currently a fellow at the Harry S. Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace at Hebrew University. He teaches at Rothberg International School, Tel Aviv University's program for overseas students, and Bar-Ilan University. His academic research and teaching include the history of modern Iran, Islamic movements in Iran and the Arab world, and nationalism and identity in Middle Eastern societies. He specializes in teaching Islam and Middle Eastern history, which is useful for us. And he's published a few articles on Iran and modern Islam, and he had a book published last year entitled National Symbols in Modern Iran, Identity, Ethnicity, and Collective Memory. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to our speaker for this evening and for the next 4 weeks, Dr. Menahem Merhavy.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's great to see you, if only virtually, and it's great to have you all virtually as well. Hopefully, before long, we'll be able to have lecture halls full of people. I'm very honored to be here, and in this journey that we have for the next 4 weeks, including today and other 3 weeks, what I want to do with you is really take you through some of the main issues that are talked about a lot on the media, on the news, and I want to try to unravel for you some of the parts that are less, I guess, familiar to the outside observer. So today's session is going to be around 2 main issues. One is the Sunni-Shiite split and the rise of Islamist movements, or Islamists as they're sometimes known, in the modern Middle East. And so these are the 2 main issues: Sunni-Shiite split and how that fits, or what role does it play in the rise of Islamism, as it's sometimes known, or radical Islam, as it's sometimes known, and has many names. I might say something about these names and which one I prefer in which context, but I will share the screen with you now. So I'm going to have a 45-minute or so of talk, and then we'll have time for a Q&A for people to raise questions, raise issues that are not clear, etc. So bear with me for the next 45 minutes, and let's go. I will share the screen now, and I want to start with something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that is the Sunni Shiite split. So I will say some of the things that might be familiar to some of you, and then try to go a little deeper into this split, things that are a little less known, I think, to again, to people who are not experts in the history of Islam. So you know, Muhammad the Prophet dies at 632, 10 years after he started his ministry, and then the next period of 25 years or so is known as the period of the righteous caliphs, Khulafa Rashidun in Arabic. These are the four: Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, or Usman here, and Ali. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, here is where with Ali, that's where the Sunni and Shiite split begins, or you can actually say it starts with Abu Bakr, because as to the question is who should lead the Muslim nation, two opinions arose. The bulk of the Muslims thought that it was, well, anybody who was around the Prophet, who was loyal to the Prophet early on, and just a small section of the people that would be known as Shia stuck to Ali and insisted that he's the only one who was entitled to lead the Muslim nation. Ali, just to mention, was both a nephew of the Prophet and also his son-in-law. He married Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad. Okay, so that is the birth of the split. And again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. What we should note at this point is that the hatred, so to speak, between the two factions, again, it's not two equal sides. It's really the vast majority and a small minority, vast majority being the Sunni Islam, the one that followed Abu Bakr, Omar, Usman, and Ali, and versus the small section that insisted that only Ali is entitled. 1 second. Okay. Now, so what I mean by one-sided hatred, it means that Sunnis have nothing against Ali. Actually, they see him as one of the four righteous caliphs, while the Shiites have a problem, well, serious problems, and that would even be an understatement, with the other three, okay, with Abu Bakr, Omar, and Osman. That's important to remember because it means that principally, theologically, the hatred is a one-way hatred of Shiites versus Sunnis and not the other way around. Okay, I will, in a couple of minutes, I'll get to the modern period. Okay, we'll be very quickly. I just bear this, I start with this because we'll see that in the 20th century, when there are attempts to bridge over the gap between Sunni and Shiite Islam, that question would arise again. How deep is that ravine, or is that valley between Sunnis and Shiites? Second, okay. One more thing to bear in mind. This is the tree, so to speak, of the family tree of the Prophet Muhammad. Not everybody's here, but the ones who are relevant to our discussion. So we have, this is Muhammad, PBUH stands for peace be upon him. That is always the blessing that follows the name of the Prophet. And he had a daughter, Fatima, and this daughter had, together with Ali, okay, they had two sons, Hassan and Hussein. They actually also had a daughter. Her name was Zainab. She's buried outside Damascus. And then there's a line of lineage of the Imams, as they're known, the descendants of Ali, all the way down to the Muntaza, the 12th Imam who disappeared as a child in Iraq. And he's the 12th, he's the Mahdi, he's the one who shall return at the end of time. Okay, so that is the, you know, for Shiites, most of Shiites, I should say, that is really what counts. That is the lineage that counts to the leadership of the Muslim nation. Okay, of course, Sunnis do not follow this. But again, my goal here is not to delve into the history of Sunni-Shiite split, but to the relevant sides of it that will help us understand the ramifications of that to the modern period. Okay. Now I want to take you just 200 years back. So we're kind of flew over 1,200 years or so now. 200 years back to, or a little less than that, to Egypt, the period, the modern period in the in our region where, sorry, Paul, I see this waiting room all the time popping up. Is there any way to get rid of that? That would be great. Okay, thank you. So I want to take you now to Egypt, to that period where, you know, if there's anything you can say in general about the Middle East, and that's something that starts actually the very last year of the 18th century, 1799, when Napoleon invades Egypt, is that from that moment on, Islamist thinkers, theologians, thinkers, intellectuals have been dealing with the problem of the Western power, okay, in different phases of it, but Western power and the way it reveals in the region. And the first generation of such thinkers, okay, were people who were ulama, as we call them, or Muslim thinkers, okay, Muslim learned people, who decided that this actually should be a journey of Islamic theology, whereby they should reveal the true powers of Islam. I'll try to explain a little further. The question was the problem that Europe seems stronger than Islamic societies. For example, Napoleon invades Egypt. The only way that the Ottomans, you know, the Islamic Empire, the rules in the region, can scare him out or you know, kick him out of the region is by British assistance. That's something that did not go unnoticed, and this was just one of many different incidents where Muslims felt that they were weaker than Europe. And by weaker than Europe, I should say this is not just a military question or a political question. Beyond that, it is a theological question, because Islam is the supreme or the superior religion. That is the superior faith. Okay, Islam came to the world with a notion of conquest, and that was something, and success, great success, and that is something that this period, I would say, shake up very much. This whole notion of security and Islamic superiority to anything that is non-Islamic, and these group of thinkers actually try to, or Islamic thinkers, try to find ways of empowering Islam, to make Islam great again, to use an American adage from our time. And one of these folks was Muhammad Abdu. Okay, he was Egyptian. He lived most of his life in Egypt, even though he visited Europe. He lived in London for a short period of time. He also traveled around in Istanbul and some other parts of the Muslim world, but most of his life was based in Egypt. He is the less famous, I would say, part of the twins, so to speak, of this Islamic thinking that I was just describing, called Islamic modernists. The more famous one is Jamaluddin al-Afghani. But I chose Abdu because his thought is, I think, gives us a better idea as to the way some Islamic trends would develop further into the modern age.
Menahem,
yes.
sorry to interrupt very briefly. A couple of people have asked if you can speak a little louder.
Oh, sure. Yes, I'll do my best. So Abdu published a bulletin together with this Afghani that I was mentioning, where they tried to present a new kind of Islam, reformed Islam, if you like. Okay, an Islam that is modern, that goes hand in hand with the language of science. Don't forget, this is the time of the fruits of the Enlightenment in Europe and the age of science. Many of you probably know that the Eiffel Tower, the famous Eiffel Tower in Paris, is just a remains of one of those exhibitions where Europe was presenting its power to the whole world. And that is the age when Abdu and Afghani were publishing their pieces and their treatises. And let's just have a brief moment of his words and try to explain what is he trying to say, what did he try to do in his life, and I'll also explain how he did it in reality during his lifetime. It wasn't just about publishing letters and treatises. I hope to see the two great religions, Islam and Christianity, hand in hand, embracing each other. Then the Torah and the Bible and the Quran will become books supporting one another, being read everywhere and respected by every nation. Okay? Men have no better guidance than examples and facts proved by experience. So the first paragraph talks about, it's exactly the notion, again, some of you might be familiar from the thought of the Enlightenment, that all religions, at least Abrahamic religions, they all point in the same direction. And there are actually nuances of one great truth, a monotheistic truth, that is basically the same, okay? And the second part, the second paragraph, sheds light on this very strong positivist thinking that was, again, that was very much the fashion at the time, to think in this way, that only what we experience is true and we can trust. We can only trust our senses, okay? Now that was, it might seem to you trivial because we're all postmodern people and we kind of learned about the modern age at school, but during his lifetime, it was very revolutionary for a Muslim thinker to say these things and to think in that way. Because the first paragraph actually challenges a very deep notion that Muslims have been grown up with for generations, and that is that Islam is superior to all religions. And the Muhammad's prophecy pretty much negates everything that came before him. Well, it kind of completes it, but it really, if you don't believe in that, it's really, there's very little worth of what you believe in. And that was challenged by the age of science that he was so deeply struck with and influenced by. And the second one challenges, the second paragraph that talks about experience, that challenges a lot of traditions about, not only about the Prophet, about people around the Prophet, about a lot of folklore, folklore beliefs, if you like, that were added to Islam with generations. It's not from the Quran or not even from Hadith, from the oral traditions, but things that came later. For example, many Muslims, till this day actually, especially in the rural parts of Muslim countries, they go to the tombs of saints, mawali as they're known in Arabic, and they pray or they ask for wishes. Just like some Jews go to, tombs of great rabbis to pray and ask for things in life. And that is something that Abdu's thought and the trend that he was part of challenged head on. Abdu himself became, he wasn't just, again, as a philosopher, a professor, he actually came to lead the greatest Sunni institute in the Muslim world, and that is Al-Azhar Institute in Cairo. Okay, the greatest learning house for Sunni Islam that's considered really by most Sunnis or all Sunnis in the world. And he led a revolution in the curriculum of this institute to include a lot of sciences, modern sciences, experiential sciences, precise sciences, and also Western philosophy, for example. All sorts of things that were completely unfamiliar to that type of learning house. And even though he was ousted from this institute at some point because of this revolution, he definitely left a huge impact on the Muslim world by putting, well, right to the face, without any embellishing of the point, that Islam should reform itself, otherwise it might disappear or it might be rendered irrelevant by the modern age. And that was really the feeling of a whole generation of Muslims, during his time and a little later towards the end of the 19th century, when it seemed that more and more Muslims are actually abandoning the ways of Islam, or see it as primitive, or especially urban educated Muslims that tended to become less devout to the faith. So I want to move on. Yes. This person might be familiar to some of you, or his face or his name, Hassan al-Banna. And he was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you might ask now, how did I jump from an Islamic modernist of the 19th century to an Islamic fundamentalist of the 20th century? In many ways, actually, Islamic political thought, as we think of it, one of the names, and the one that I prefer for what sometimes is known as fundamentalist Islam or Islamic fundamentalism, is political Islam. That is often, by the way, the term that is referred to it in Arabic, political Islam, al-Islam al-Siyasi. And Hassan al-Banna, in many ways, is the son of this kind of thought. Okay. Now, how is that? How come? Because here's at least two elements that we see continuity between the Islamic modernists, again, if you like, the sons of the Enlightenment in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, and Islamic political thought. Okay, one is the notion that Islam is under threat. It's under a serious challenge by Western powers, Western thought, Western military. Okay, it's an ongoing attack that hasn't ceased till this day, from the moment, if you like, from the moment Napoleon stepped foot on Egyptian soil in 1799. It's that bad. Yes, it's been going on for a little more than 200 years now. That is one idea that they take from them. So the need of Islam to change, to empower itself in order to be able to be relevant and to be able to stand up to this ongoing onslaught of Western power, thought, Christianity, etc. Okay, that is one element. The second element is, well, there is the rational element. The rational element says it goes against, Islamic political thought goes very much against all folklore religion, a lot against what they call superstitions. All of those things that were added to religion. I just gave you one example, and that is the praying or asking for wishes by tombs of saints. That's one important element. Other elements, for example, were, Islamic, political thinkers went against, for example, some other festivals that were added to Islam. Originally, Islam has two festivals, Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr. These are the two. But if you would ask a Muslim, how many holidays do you have? They would mention a whole line of others that are not one of the two. Okay, you have the birth of the Prophet, and you have, there was Nabi Musa, okay, the birth or the burial site of Moses. And there's a line of others. So what are all these other holidays? They were added along the years because Muslims wanted to have more holidays. You know, they were often envious of their Christian or Jewish sometimes neighbors, and Islam didn't provide them with enough of that, so they added. And these additions, both Islamic modernists and Muslim thinkers of the 20th century have thought were actually a bad idea. Okay, they're actually I would say they sow bad seeds in Islam. They derail it from its original purity, okay, etc. The harshest criticism sometimes is that they consider it to be shirk. Shirk means polytheism, when you share other gods with Allah. That is the worst thing one can do. So Hassan al-Banna was born and lived all his life actually in Egypt. He didn't travel around like Muhammad Abdu. And he was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, he was of a rural background, but he got a good Islamic upbringing in early 20th century Egypt. And his time was, if Abdu's time, its main, I would say, element, okay, the main theme that Abdu was confronting was the Enlightenment, European power. In the time of Hassan al-Banna, it was already the fruit of that is British occupation of Egypt, or influence towards occupation of Egypt. From World War I onwards, it was pretty much an occupation. And that was one element. And the second element was the rise of nationalism. Nationalism, that element that makes Egyptians, Syrians, Lebanese, etc., nations, or at least the attempt to make them nations, was something that the Islamic thinkers of the 20th century found to be a very challenging idea. Now, you might think from 2020, it seems a little strange what I've just said. What do you mean? Nationalism and religion go very well together. Well, yes, today it seems like they do fare pretty well, but they were on a head-on collision for quite some time. Why is that? Because let's take an Egyptian, for example. If you are an Egyptian, you have about 10% in your country, which is about 8.5 million people, who are Copts or Christians. And if you, by the thought of Hassan al-Banna, by the thought of the Muslim Brotherhood, you are closer as an Egyptian Muslim to a Pakistani Muslim or to an Indonesian Muslim than you are to your Christian Coptic neighbor. Okay, because so in other words, the two circles of identity could actually collide pretty badly. Or, for example, if you have a nationalist government, that's exactly the situation we'll be dealing with shortly, nationalist government that goes against religion or doesn't seem to give religion its right place. Okay, so I will try to summarize in just three more sentences. Hassan al-Banna, after we read him, it is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its law on all nations and to extend its power to the entire planet. Okay, that seems like a very, very expansionist kind of thinking. But in essence, what al-Banna tried to lead was a Muslim society that would eventually have a Sharia law country, a Sharia country run by Sharia law. That is the ultimate goal of Islamist movements. The Muslim Brotherhood is the oldest and the oldest of the modern ones in the Sunni world, we can say. It has branches everywhere. Hamas was born out of this movement. The Islamic movement of Israel was also born out of that. So it really has a worldwide. It has branches in Europe, in the US, etc. One more paragraph from al-Banna before I give you kind of a tour de force of his life and some of his achievements. Your nafs, soul, is your first battlefield. If you are victorious over it, then you will find the other battlefields easier. Okay. So I wanted to give it a little bit of thought. What is he trying to say here? Banna did not try to take over the state. He was living in already an independent Egyptian state. Well, independent with some limitations because the British still had some influence over the state of affairs in Egypt, especially its foreign affairs. But overall, Egypt had, it had a king, it had an independent parliament, etc. And yet, the feeling was, at least among Banna and a group of other, a whole cohort of other thinkers like himself, that Islam is removed from the I would say, from the social space, from the social sphere. Okay, Islam is a private matter, okay? And that really bothered them because Islam, in its essence, the way they saw it, Islam in its essence is social. Since it's social, you need to have a devout society that would demand Islam to reign supreme and not just be another part of life. Okay, that that thought that came from the West that religion is a private matter is one of those things that Islamist thinkers have been trying to fight for many years now. It's not a private matter. It should be a social, a political, a state matter. Okay, and it should not be just a private matter. But how do you do that? Okay, so the question, right? How do you do that? Well, basically, there are two ways to do that. One is to try to take over the government, to topple the government, to launch some coup and kill whoever is in power and try to take it. That was not Banna's way. Banna's way was to try and work very slowly. It was not going to happen in a year or two, and slowly but surely to advance towards a more Islamic society, and eventually that society would shape a better, a more Islamic kind of leadership. Okay, so it's working from the bottom up and not from the top down. So it's bottom up kind of Islamist thought. You need a lot of patience to have that that kind of work, and Banna knew it's not going to take him a year or two. He wasn't even sure it's going to take him a lifetime. And actually, speaking about life, he was assassinated in 49 when he was on his way to a meeting with the minister of the Egyptian government. So it's not so unlikely what the Muslim Brotherhood says, that he was assassinated by this minister. I mean, the whole meeting was actually a plot to assassinate him. Now, why would they assassinate him? I would make the question even harder. In 48, al-Banna ordered the Muslim Brothers to volunteer for the war in Palestine, for the jihad in Palestine. That's what we call the War of Independence here. And they went in masses, and a considerable number of them were killed in the battlefields here in Israel. So why would the Egyptian government see him as an enemy of the state? Well, because some of the people, especially some of his supporters, became more and more vociferous in their demands to turn to an Islamic state, to make Sharia the law of the land. Now, this is something that here you see the breakaway of the Muslim Brothers, other Islamic political thinkers, from that that line of the Enlightenment. They take some elements. Again, they take science, which is why you don't see Islamists avoiding phones or avoiding anything that's technological. It's the other way around. They take it wholeheartedly, but they make this definition between values and science. You take science, you reject the values of the West. So they take that from that generation of enlightenment that I was mentioning of Abdu and the others, but their goal for an Islamic state was something that Abdu could not even think of, could not even dream of. Okay, I should also mention, to kind of be fair to them, the state or the society became more and more secular with the years. It was influence of Britain. It was influence of Western culture in general. The young generation of what is sometimes known as Effendiya, those people who grew up with good education in Arabic about Western thought, they drifted away from the realm of faith. If you look at Egypt, for example, in the 1940s, it is much less, the average Egyptian, the average urban Egyptian, I should say, is much less religious than his, let's say, ancestors just one generation, not to mention two generations earlier. So there was definitely a lot in truth in this feeling of fear that Hassan al-Banna, expressed. This fear that Islam will be rendered irrelevant, but the way he worked was through the very everyday, the mundane issues of everyday life. Encourage people to pray. Make sure there's a prayer house in every workplace. Encourage people to learn something about the Quran before, after work. It's called halakat, circles of learning. Small matters, not take over the government. He wrote very little about jihad. He wrote a little bit about that, but very little about that. A question of caution. And yet, the fact is that this kind of patience with the long road ahead was something that would disappear in the next generation of Islamists, which I turn to now. I would just mention before I get to this generation that 1952, of course, is a watershed in Egypt. I'm focusing here on Egypt because Egypt is really the flagpost, the flagship of these developments. But to a large degree, you can say in different contours, the same trajectory is true to many other countries in the region. So the rise of Nasser, Nasserism as it was known, Nasser was half a god in the Arab world, especially from 56 onwards, after he faced, Israel, Britain and France together in the Suez War. That created him into who he was, really. And Nasser for the Islamists was a very different kind of enemy. It's not just Nasser the person; it's also Nasser the phenomenon. That is nationalism. This speaking on behalf of authenticity. Okay, you cannot blame Nasser that he's a foreign agent, for example, the kind of which people did actually the king of Egypt before the 52 coup. You cannot even blame him that he's a heretic, at least not in the early years of his rule. Okay, he would often present himself as a good Muslim. He often spoke in the name of Islam, and yet, time and again, he found himself with an head-on collision with the Muslim Brotherhood. And actually, the expectations from Nasser were great, because when he rose to power, he gave the Muslim Brotherhood a great role in the Revolutionary Council that he created when he took over Egypt in '52. So the expectations were, at least among some of them, that the next move would be, well, to make Islam really great in Egypt and to have Sharia law in the country. And that was not to happen. Okay, the person who I would say embodied these great expectations more than anyone else was Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb would become the ultimate shaheed, martyr for the Islamic cause in Egypt and around the world. Okay, so much so that following the 9/11 attacks, Bin Laden's right-hand man, Ayman al-Zawahiri, also an Egyptian, would write a book, and he dedicated to Sayyid Qutb, who was a hero for him when he was a child, was like a young man when Qutb was executed in '66. He dedicates this book to Qutb, and he also attests that when he saw what happened to Qutb, and I'll explain in a few minutes what happened to him and how that happened, he realized that there is no land for the true Muslims. They are on the run, they're renegades, until they really create a base outside of the Muslim world, or at least outside of the far-reaching hands of the authorities in the Muslim world, and they will reconquer. Just like Muhammad did. Muhammad did this in Mecca. He was expelled out of Mecca. He had to flee because his life was in danger. And then he went to another city called Yathrib, later on known as Medina. And he created that city. That's where he created the first congregation of believers. And with these believers, he went and conquered back Mecca, where he came from. That is the model that Islamists of the generation after Qutb would lead. I want to still go back to Qutb and stay with Qutb for a minute. Qutb was a very interesting man. He was a liberal, secular thinker, actually a literary critic, who had very modernized ideas, if you like, secularized ideas about Islam. And then in '49, Qutb does something that would change his life forever, and that is he went on a short visit to the US. You would not believe what a short visit to the US does to some people. And he returns after about a year from the US, a very different man. He's now a radical, an Islamic fanatic, the kind of which very few could actually match. And his idea is that Islam, what he saw in America shocked him so much. This is America of the late '40s, the post-World War II, if you like, the most capitalist, America you could have in those years. And it's also very racist. He was also aware of that, by the way. He was dark-skinned, and he kind of he did not go unnoticed, separate taps, separate bathrooms, etc. I was shocked by that too. It's very interesting. And the notions that he came back from America were that if we don't do something really radical very, very soon, Islam is going to be extinct. True Islam, because and this is the great break from al-Banna, from pretty much everything that preceded him. For al-Qutb, for Sayyid Qutb, most of the people who say they're Muslim, they're not true Muslims. A true Muslim is only a person who is 100% devoted to Islam. A Muslim country is only a country that is 100% devoted to Islam. There's no other law but God's law in that land. And that is something that did not exist, well, has not existed actually almost in history ever. Which is why he reaches the conclusion that what we thought that happened in history until now, he lived in the 1950s, 1960s, what we thought had happened, that there was a long period of darkness, then there was the great light of Muhammad, and then everything changed. right? After that, nothing is of that period of ignorance. Then no, that is not true. That historiography I've just showed you is not true. And it actually is, there is a Jahiliyyah, there is an age of ignorance after Muhammad. There's polytheism, um, there is idol worship all over the place, actually, especially in Muslim countries. Because most of the people who say they're Muslim, they are not fighting to the last drop of blood for Islam to reign supreme. They just like Islam because it's nice. It's part of the culture. He abhorred all these expressions. That's exactly what you shouldn't do. Islam should be your way of life, period. If it's not all of your life, it is nothing. Okay. So in Kutub, you don't see this patience of all of that is completely shoved aside, and there's this radicalism that says it either happens now or it never does. And he wrote many books. He wrote a whole commentary on the Quran. He became the ultimate shahid. I will say in a minute how, but his book that would also be used in court against him is this book you see on the right. Well, this English translation, Ma'alim fi Tariq, the signposts on the road. And in that book, it's like it's very repetitive. This book, by the way, it's a small booklet. Very repetitive. You can almost rehearse it. And it talks about how our world is on the brink of oblivion, how we are really standing on the threshold of complete oblivion of Islam and everything that's worth anything in humanity. It's very, very dark in its atmosphere. He just leaves a tiny, tiny bit of room for hope, and that is if we, the true Muslims, the very few that have survived, will raise the chosen few, the Taliyah, the chosen few, the pioneers, the avant-garde, who would be able to re-lead Islam, then there is some hope of Islam to save itself. In other words, we are exactly like in the time of the Prophet. We are surrounded by ignorant people, by idol worshippers, including all of those who go to the mosque and prostrate there when they pray. All of that, all of these people, almost all of them are complete infidels. And what we need to do is to develop this group of the chosen few. Okay, let's see what were his main challenges when he wrote. Okay, Islam came to establish only one relationship which binds men together in the sight of God, and if this relationship is firmly established, then all other relationships based on blood or other considerations become eliminated. To say that in 1960s Egypt, it's very clear that he's going very much against nationalism of Nasser. When Nasser makes nationalism really a religion in its own right, and everything that opposes nationalism, at least in the formula of Nasser, is really like a heretic. It's someone who does not deserve to live. Let's see again what he says down here. I'll read just part of it. Any country which fights the Muslim because of his belief and prevents him from practicing his religion, and in which the Sharia is suspended, is Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Harb is the land of war. It's the un-Islamic land. Even though his family or his relatives or his people live in it, or his capital is invested and his trade or commerce is in that country. Okay. Qutb saw in I would say in dying eyes how most Muslims actually, they're quietists. They do not stand up against the what he saw as the great dictatorship of Nasser, the infidel ways of life that he was leading. Okay. Now the question was not how Nasser himself lived. It was more about what kind of Islam does Nasser, develop in Egypt. And here I want to take you to watch a short video with me. 1 second. I'll stop the share to take you to another screen. Yes, I will also share with you the link with which I do that, because I know sometimes these things don't go so well. So I just sent you the link, but I'm watching it here, and I'll share the screen with you so you can do that if you like. 1 second. Oh my Why can't I share the screen with you guys? Sorry. Yeah, there you go. So this is Nasser describing his encounter with the Muslim Brotherhood over the question of hijab, what they expected him to do regarding the hijab.
في سنة 53 كنا نريد فعلا مخلصين ان احنا نتعاون مع الاخوان المسلمين على ان يسيروا في الطريق الصحيح والطريق السليم. وقابلت المرشد العام للاخوان المسلمين وقعد وطلب مطالب. طلب ايه؟ اول حاجة قال لي يجب ان تقيم الحجاب في مصر وتخلي كل واحدة تمشي في الشارع تلبس طرحة. كل واحدة تمشي. وانا قلت له يعني اذا الواحد قال هذا الكلام بيقولوا رجعنا لايام الحاكم بامر الله اللي كان بيخلي الناس ما يمشيش بالنهار ويمشوا بالليل. انا في رايي ان كل واحد في بيته هو اللي ينفذ هذا الكلام. فقال لي لا انت باعتبارك الحاكم مسؤول. قلت له يا استاذ انت ليك بنت في كلية الطب مش لابسة طرحة ولا حاجة، ما لبستهاش طرحة ليه؟ طب استاذ إذا كنت أنت مش قادر تلبس بنت واحدة اللي هي بنتك طرحة، عايزنا ننزل نلبس 10 مليون طرح في البلد؟
I think you could get the idea from this video of Nasser making fun of the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. One second. Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you. And that was the head-on collision between nationalism and the Muslim Brotherhood, or at least that branch of the Brotherhood. I should also mention that Qutb was not a typical Muslim brother. He was very active in the movement at some point, but then their paths diverged because many in the Brotherhood and other Islamists who saw him also saw his fate. He was executed in 1966 by Nasser following it's not clear whether it really happened or not, but anyway, the allegation was that he was conspiring against the state, that he had a whole special cell that was planning a coup and to assassinate Nasser, etc. Believe it or not, in '67, when Israel, beat the Egyptian army in the '67 war, June '67, many of the brothers who were in prison were celebrating that victory as some kind of God's, punishment, God's prize, taking the toll of what happened to Qutb and others. I will just take a couple of more minutes to kind of finish I would say this kind of circle that I'm taking you, this journey with Islamists, and then we'll turn to Q&A. I will share the screen with you once more. One second. Yes. So bear with me just a few more minutes. So Qutb's fate, in a way, was something that did not go unnoticed, of course, by many Islamists. And they reacted in two ways. One was to step back from that whole idea of taking over the state and to go back to Banna's, approach, even more peaceful pacifist than Banna and say, you know, we need to work very closely, very slowly with society. We should not go against the state. This is not a good idea. We cannot allow it because we cannot afford it. The state is just way too powerful. And also maybe it's not a good idea in the first place. Maybe the state could actually be a great tool in the future, and we shouldn't try to, you know, we shouldn't try to attack it, because attacking it might weaken all of society together, including its Islamic elements. So it's not necessarily a good idea to attack it. But a group of Islamists actually, I would say, took Qutb's ideas by, you know, by their word, and the result that they came up with, the conclusion was that we should actually do just like Muhammad. We should actually leave Egypt. We should leave home, even leave the Muslim world, if that's what it takes, in order to reconquer it in the future. And so one more person to know, again, he's less famous than others like Bin Laden and Zawahiri. He was actually the godfather of Bin Laden. Yusuf Azzam, Abdullah Azzam, he's a Palestinian, by the way, and he cultivated this group of what was sometimes known as the Afghan Arabs. Okay, the volunteers in Afghanistan who fought the Russians, who fought the Soviets there in the mid to late 70s. And the Afghanistan was a rallying call because it was against the great enemy. Believe it or not, it wasn't America at the time, it was the Soviets, it was the communism. And Azzam would become the godfather of all those volunteers, including ISIS people who roam around the Sinai today. And as I mentioned, Osama bin Laden, people who established Al-Qaeda. All of those had a greater goal, and the greater goal was to conquer home. But in order to do that, they believed, since that is not feasible during these times at least, they thought it's better to actually start with the weaker chain in the link, just like communist kind of thought. So the thought was, well, we'll go to those places where we can actually fight, and there's no real authority around the place. And from that place, that will be our base. Base in Arabic is Al-Qaeda. That will be our base, and from there we can actually move on and conquer again those countries. And that will also be a great inspiration, you know, for other Muslims. Just two more sentences before I take it to Q&A. What's interesting is that those Islamists, especially Sayyid Qutb, others that I will deal with next week in Iran, in the Shiite world, what's interesting is that you see that when you read Islamic thinking like that, you see that the gaps between the Sunni and the Shia actually narrow down to almost nothing. And they were, some of them at least were aware of that, since the goals are pretty much the same, then you know, the divide between Sunnis and Shiites that we started with becomes less tangible, even less significant, which is why one of the interesting movements in the 20th century, I'll deal with it in the fourth lecture, I'll return to that, is a movement called Taqrib, just like from the word karov in Hebrew, getting close. And Taqrib was a movement to try to bridge over the gap between Sunnis and Shiites. Okay, so the Islamists that I've mentioned today did not work in this direction, but they lay the foundations for some of what others would do. And we'll talk in future lectures about how that played out. You know, what was the potential of bridging over this gap? How did the West and Western enemies and other enemies of Islam as they saw it played into that bridging over the gap, and why, a little spoiler, why didn't it work? Why Sunni and Shiite Islam are still separate quite as much as they have ever been. So I'll stop here and we'll take it to questions.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Menahem. Okay, we have a few questions already, and I'm going to invite people to continue writing questions in the chat box as they have them. Before I get to questions, let me just say, because I know that some people may leave early because they have to leave the lecture early, I just want to make a point of saying that we have over the next, as I said, the next 3 weeks after this one, continuing this series. Next week we're looking at Iran, the week after the Arab Spring, and finally concluding with a look at Israel and the challenges for Israel specifically in the region. Okay, so there were a couple of questions about Muhammad Abdu, and a couple of people were struck by the fact that when he talks about the great religions of Christianity and Islam, he doesn't mention Judaism. He mentions the Torah, but he doesn't mention Judaism. Was that a deliberate oversight? What was the reason for that?
I honestly don't know for sure, but my simple thought would be that his knowledge and his encounter with Jews was minimal, if anything. So he just did not encounter them. You know, in Israel, in this country, there were hardly any Jews at the time. He probably didn't met many of them, if any, in Europe. So it was really about Christianity, you know, the other universal religion that he was interested in. That's also where, you know, enlightenment as he knew it came from.
Right. Okay. Question about Hassan al-Banna. We have a question about whether he was active with al-Husseini, Hajj Amin al-Husseini during World War II, and if he sided with the fascists. And if I can expand that question a little, was there any influence on political Islam from European fascism?
Yes, there was some influence, but it's influence through the back door. Overall, I would say most Islamists and most thinkers in the region, unlike maybe some common thoughts about that, were disenchanted with Nazism and with fascism. However, since Nazism and the Nazis were enemies of the despised enemy in Egypt, for example, in other parts of the region as well, Britain, then the enemy of my enemies rule worked here sometimes. And now I would not say some were attracted to this power of fascism. You know, the orderly, you know, the banners with fire and of you know, fascist ceremonies, etc. But that was on the margins. So I would say, yeah, there was some fascination with the fact that these seems to be the enemy that might challenge really, you know, imperialism of Europe, and that was the main point behind that.
And did al-Banna have any relationship with al-Husseini in World War II?
Well, I don't know of any direct relationship, but it's definitely possible. He definitely saw eye to eye with Husseini regarding Palestine. I mean, there was no question about you know, the fact that the Jews here. I can also add something about that. Even though I'll deal with it more elaborately when we talk about Israel in the region. It's at least it was seen as no coincidence by hindsight that, you know, 1882 was the year that the British took control over Egypt, and as you probably know, it's also the year of the first Aliyah. And Muslim thinkers made that connection early on and said, you know, this is actually a two-pronged attack against the Muslim nation. Some say, you know, they're Jews from Europe, and the others are just doing it directly. But it's two sides of the same coin.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have a question about the Sunni-Shia split. I'm just going to read it as it's written. You mentioned in the beginning the differences in view Shia and Sunni Muslims hold with the four caliphates. Are the broader Sunni and Shia differences irreconcilable and therefore likely for the tensions between them to worsen over time, or is the opposite the case?
I missed the first part of your question about the caliphs. How did it start?
Just the fact that you mentioned that there are these differences, and the question is, are these differences irreconcilable? Are they going to get worse over time, or are they actually going to end up getting closer together, the two sides?
Well, again, it's very hard to say because it really depends on the thinker and the time. But overall, you can say that the modern age put Muslims and Muslim thinkers in the same, all over the Muslim world, Sunni and Shiite alike, in, you know, under the same challenges, and they felt under the same attack. Again, attack not necessarily militarily speaking, but an attack all the same. So the thought was that, well, we have something greater in common than some feud from the 1400 years ago. And that line of thought led to the Taqrib movement, that movement that said, you know, we should actually speak of one Islam and not two Islams, and Sunni and Shiite. You know, that the whole question of, you know, Muhammad's heir heritage, you know, it's not such a big deal. We should get over that. However, the fact is also that other forces that were working at the same time and again, we'll see it in different sides of it in the next meetings, have worked to widen the gap, or to make it, other elements, I would say, were added to the gap. But I will just answer one more sentence about the theological issue. In principle, as I said, the hatred is one-sided, Shiite toward the Sunni leaders of early Islam. However, with time, first of all, Shiites have added other elements to the faith that Sunnis regard with either ridicule or even worse. And that is the whole death, the martyrdom of Hussein, for example, in Karbala, when they commemorate that in a special holiday called Ashura. It's something that Sunnis see as very odd, if not even bordering with infidelity. And the other element, and I will just mention it in one sentence, is the question of the holiness or the wholeness of the Quran. Okay, what's behind me? Someone asked, is one of the greatest, commentaries on the Quran, Tafsir al-Mizan. And the question of the wholeness of the Quran. So, because if the Quran is complete and so perfect, as Sunnis tend to say, and all Muslims are supposed to think, then why doesn't it say simply that Ali is the heir of the Prophet and the Imams are the leaders of the Muslim nation after that? What's in that text? So Shiites, broadly speaking, had two ways of dealing with this question. One is to say, well, it says it, but you just don't see it. In other words, you need to read some verses allegorically, and then you'll see the message behind it. Okay, that actually says that Ali is the right heir. And that's a very bad way in the eyes of most Sunni thinkers to read the Quran in general. You don't read it allegorically. And the other Shiite thought was even worse. And it says, well, the text we have, it's true. The Quran we have doesn't say it because it was doctored. Someone dealt with this text and left out some messages that were supposed to be there. And that's really bordering on heresy for many Sunnis.
Can you just, while we're on the Sunni Shia question, I just because there were a couple of questions where people were asked after some kind of clarity. Can you just clarify the roughly the percentages of Sunni Shia in the Middle East? Obviously, it's majority Sunni. What sort of numbers are we talking percentage-wise?
So today we're talking about roughly 40% Shiite and 60% Sunni. That's pretty good for the Shiites, because it used to be very different. All over the Muslim world, we're talking about much lower, because of course, a lot of Muslims don't live in the Middle East.
Right.
So all over the Muslim world, we're talking about 1585 to Sunnis, wow. Okay? But in the Middle East, because we have Iraq, we have, if I include Iran, of course, Lebanon, we have some large Shiite communities, and that makes it 40-60. Iran is vastly majority Shiite. Iraq is about 65% Shiite. Lebanon is around 40 to 50% Shiite. So that's a very important element.
Great. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Is it true that Islam, I'm reading this as it's written, is it true that Islam appropriated Christian and Jewish prophets?
Yes, but it's a very Jewish or Christian way of seeing it. So, Islam recognizes the greatness of prophets that preceded it. So yes, Moses, Aaron, Jesus, Paul, Mary, yeah, they're all Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, of course, and a whole line of others. Yes, everybody who recognized one God in heaven before Muhammad has a special status in the eyes of Muslims, and it's called Hanif. It's people who saw truth before it was revealed in its fullest form. So Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. He's not the only prophet. He's not the first prophet. He's the seal he's the last prophet. That is really the element. And by the way, here's another element that Sunnis and Shiites can argue about, because the way Shiites deal with Ali and the Imams, well, they're pretty equal to prophets, even if they don't call it by name. So Sunnis also have a problem with that.
Right. Okay, a question about Qutb. What would you say is his lasting legacy today in Egyptian society? How is he considered in Egypt today?
Well, it really depends on who you are in Egypt. I mean, if you're a Muslim, Islamist, fundamentalist, political thinker, well, for the most part, he hasn't left much legacy. His legacy is outside of Egypt, for the most part, because the Muslim Brotherhood has estranged itself and even took a few steps back, putting Qutb kind of in a glass. Well, he's a martyr, but don't join him, kind of approach. And I would say what happened to him was also, a warning sign to many Islamists. You know, don't mess with the state, don't mess with nationalism the way he did. You know, he wrote very harsh things about nationalism in general. The kind of things that you don't hear from Islamists almost ever since then. So again, if you talk about legacy, if you want to talk about people who saw in him maybe a great thinker, you would go to the people who toppled the towers in the U.S. in 2001, or you know, suicide bombers. You know, these kind of people definitely would seem as a great, you know, a great model. Yes.
What about Hamas? I'm just thinking from an Israeli perspective. Hamas would also...
So they would have respect for him because he died for the right thing, but they don't necessarily agree with his tactics. And it's not just a question about ideology, maybe. And also he did something that most Islamists, including Hamas, do not do, and that is called takfir. Takfir is when one person announces another an infidel while they say they're Muslim. In other words, if I say I'm a Muslim, you don't have anybody, no one has the right to tell me I'm not. You can, you know, reprimand me for a specific thing I did wrong. That is fine. But you can't say you're not a Muslim, even though you say you are. That very thing is considered to be very fanatic by most Islamists even. So you know, by most standards, I would say, as much as they have respect for him, they have quite diverted from his legacy.
Okay. Okay, we have a question here which I fear could have a very long lecture-long answer. So I'm going to ask you to try and keep it short. But the question is, okay, what caused the change in Muslim attitudes towards Jews from the time of the so-called Golden Age of Spain to the modern era?
Wow. Well, really, in a nutshell, I'll refer to something I've already said. Jews as Jews, for the most part, are not a problem, even though some Islamists are actually also anti-Semites. I'll add something about that as well. But it's mostly Jews as coming to the Middle East to create an independent entity in the middle of the Muslim land. That's really what this is about for the most part. However, since, you know, people in life are very flexible things, once that happened, Muslim thinkers also developed a very new kind of thinking. I'm saying new because it really was born somewhere in the early to middle 20th century, not before then, that really borders on racism of Jews. It's not racism in the purest sense of the word like in Europe, but it's very close to that. So Said Qutb, for example, he wrote a whole book called Ma'rakatuna Ma'al Yahud, our war, our struggle against the Jews. And Abdallah Azzam saw communism and capitalism as two curses that the Jews brought to the world. So that kind of anti-Semitic thinking was very much absorbed by you know, by Islamists. And ironically, I think they often got it from the worst enemies, from those you know, from some of the thinkers in the West that developed this kind of anti-Semitic thought. Qutb, for one thing, was definitely very much influenced by this post-World War I thought that Europe is a decadence and the Jews are responsible for it, that kind of thinking that the Nazis also used.
Right. I'm not sure how you'll answer this, but what percentage of the Muslim world holds a fundamentalist view? And is this mainstream religious Muslim thinking now? And I'm assuming that fundamentalist here is defined as you defined it, which is thinking about it in terms of political Islam, Qutb, the Brotherhood.
Wow, that would be very hard. I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but I would say it's pretty low. And also, what do you mean by, like, are they in favor of someone else doing it, or are they in favor of doing it themselves? If you're talking about doing it themselves, then I have kind of rough estimates, and that would be very low. That would be like much less than 0.1%. You know, just a handful of thousands, maybe in a world of hundreds of millions. If you're talking about people in favor of it, then you might get a bigger number. But again, you know, the gap between what people are in favor of and what they're actually going to do is tremendous in these matters. Okay. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, sure. I want just a kind of related to this question. I think someone asked about whether Syria and Turkey are going to come up in the sessions, and because I assume that Syria will come up when we talk about the Arab Spring. Turkey, I think, will be less relevant to our topic. So maybe you could say something here about the direction Turkey have taken under Erdogan, and at least from a non-expert position, I would see it as a more Islamist direction under Erdogan.
Well, yes, I'll really do it in a nutshell, and yes, I will refer to it when I speak about the Arab Spring.
Yeah, okay.
Even though Turkey is not Arab, but yes, I will talk about the Middle East around the Arab Spring. I'll also talk a little bit about Iran around that topic, even though it's not Arab. You can avoid these two big ones who are not Arab and are in the region in that way or another. But yes, so really in a nutshell, Turkey has been grappling with this question of what is the role of religion in its identity, its political identity as well. And yes, Erdogan, of course, is an Islamist. It's no secret. However, the way he's often depicted as some new sultan or something like that, it's a little ridiculous if only for the fact that it's true that there's some, longing for the Ottoman period. In today's Turkey, you see it in fashion and other things, not just in politics. However, at the same time, Erdogan, as much as an Islamist, is very much a nationalist. And again, this also goes back to that question about Qutb. Most Islamists today, including Hamas, of course, of Gaza, they're very much nationalists. And all of that ultra-nationalist thinking of Qutb is quite far from them. Even if they have some appreciation for the guy, they definitely would not take this element from his legacy of this ultra-national, anti-nationalist thought. Qutb was hardcore anti-national. Nationalism for him was infidelity, period.
Okay. So I'm gonna ask one last question, and then I think we'll call it a night. Or maybe two questions, one that's very quick. The first one is, it's kind of, I guess it's a challenge to the question about anti-Semitism in Islam. Surely, the question goes, surely the Jews in Mecca were slaughtered because they refused to convert back in the Quran.
Yeah. So is that a question, or is it?
Yeah, like as in, how does that fit with the idea that Jewish, that anti-Semitism is more connected to the Jews coming back to the Middle East?
Yeah, I would say there's not much connection. It's true that in early Islam there was great disappointment with the Jews for not joining in to that, not seeing the light. And
right.
The Quran also has some verses speaking about taking on some Christian themes that, Jews are known not to recognize a prophet when they see one. They killed one already. So yes, there is definitely that element in the Quran and in early Islam, and Muhammad himself was very disappointed with the Jews, and it's true, yes, he massacred a bunch of those. But overall, I would say it has very little to do with the modern hatred of the Jews, because, in many places around the world, around the Muslim world, Jews live with Muslims, as it's true, not as equal citizens, because the whole concept was not in existence until about 200 years ago. But yes, as some kind of respected minority, acknowledged minority, etc. For the most part, the hatred of the Jews, not around Qutb circles, by the way, but more around nationalist Islamist circles, is around the fact that we try to take over, to drive a wedge in the middle of the Muslim land. That's really what this is about. Now, it's true that to that, there are also some Islamist elements that kind of mingle very well in. They don't just come and want to rule here. They also teach their bad ways to the locals. But that's exactly what Muslims used to say about Western people who came to the region. So Jews are not that different than Christians or others who came to the region in this regard, in the modern period, of course.
Okay.
Was there any other?
Yeah. Final, very short question. Someone asked about your backdrop, about the picture behind you of the books, the Arabic books.
Yes, I was explaining.
They asked what it was.
Yes, it's one of the greatest commentaries of the Quran, Tafsir al-Mizan, the Balance, it's called, and it's just one of my favorite commentaries on the Quran. Okay, it's actually by an Iranian scholar.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Menahem Merhavy. I hope everyone enjoyed that and was suitably enlightened and informed. We'll have another session with Dr. Merhavy next week. As I said, the topic will be Iran, which is, I think, every year grows increasingly relevant for us here in Israel and anyone interested in what's happening in the Middle East and perhaps beyond the Middle East. For those of you that are not on my mailing list, I've just written my email address in the chat box. paulg@begancenter.org.il, so you can email me and I can send you more details. Otherwise, we'll be advertising Dr. Merhavy's talk over the next week or so. And in any case, if you were on this talk, the link that you use, the Zoom link that you use for this talk, will also be valid for next week at the same time, 8:30 Israel time next Wednesday. So thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Merhavy.
You're most welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.